Nobody in that classroom suspected the quiet girl with the gentle Mexican accent carried a destiny far beyond their narrow expectations. When Maria timidly answered the teacher's question, he froze, then barked with chilling authority, "Speak English or get out." Laughter rippled through the rows of desks as she lowered her gaze, desperately swallowing back tears of shame. Yet in that moment of scorn, something ignited deep within her, a resolve to master the very language used to cast her aside. Years later, fate would guide them both back to that very assembly hall. Maria would step forward not as the frightened child in the back row but as a celebrated speaker whose story of resilience had inspired a generation. The retired teacher, seated among the audience, would hear her name called and feel the weight of his own harsh words echo in his memory. And when his eyes met hers across the hushed room, the silence that followed would mark the beginning of an unexpected reckoning, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about strength, forgiveness, and the power of a single phrase. In the early morning light, the hallways of Roosevelt Middle School echoed with the faint rustle of students' backpacks and the soft creak of locker doors swinging open. Maria Ramirez emerged from the shadows of the corridor, clutching her well-worn English textbook and a spiral notebook filled with careful notes. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat braid, and though her uniform was clean, the fabric bore the faint fraying of countless washes. She paused at the threshold of room 204, where a small nameplate announced the territory of one Mr. Wilson, the English teacher whose reputation for strictness was legendary among both students and parents. Maria took a deep breath and stepped inside, aware that this day would unfold like any other, but with a weight she carried alone. The classroom was an austere space defined by rows of metal-framed desks, fluorescent lights that hummed overhead, and walls lined with laminated charts of irregular verbs and common idioms. A single American flag hung in the corner, its seams shuddering slightly with the draft from a nearby vent. Sunlight filtered through slatted blinds, casting narrow bands of illumination across the scuffed linoleum floor. Maria moved to her usual seat in the middle row, third desk from the aisle, and arranged her supplies in meticulous order. Each pencil, eraser, and sheet of paper was placed with deliberate care, as if the precision of her workspace might shield her from the judgment that hovered in the air. A few classmates trickled in, offering quick, whispered greetings to each other before settling into their own routines. Some exchanged jokes in low tones, while others slipped headphones into their ears, lost in private worlds of music or gaming. Maria tried to join in with a shy smile, but the barrier of her accent made her self-conscious. The soft hum of the classroom was punctuated by the ticking of a wall clock, its hands inching forward toward the moment of contact with Mr. Wilson. She felt the stirrings of tension in her chest, a mix of anticipation and dread that had become all too familiar. When Mr. Wilson finally strode in, his presence was immediate and commanding. He was a tall man with stern features, salt and pepper hair cropped close to his scalp, and eyes that scanned the room with clinical precision. His suit jacket was crisply tailored, as if he wore his authority like an invisible armor. Without acknowledgement or greeting, he moved methodically to the front of the room and began arranging his materials on a lectern. The murmurs in the classroom died down, replaced by an expectant silence that pressed against the walls. The lesson commenced with a brief review of the previous day's homework, but it quickly became clear that Mr. Wilson's attention was narrowed like the beam of a spotlight, focused on the smallest deviation from his standards. He called on students whose pronunciation was perfect, praising their clarity, then moved on to others whose inflections or mispronunciations drew curt corrections. Maria could feel her heart rate accelerate as the discussion turned to phrasal verbs and the nuances of prepositions. She opened her mouth to contribute when she recognized the answer, but the hesitation that accompanied her accent kept her silent. The moment passed, and the class continued without her participation. At the near end of the review, Mr. Wilson pivoted to a more advanced exercise, a translation task meant to reveal understanding of both grammar and idiomatic usage. Several students raised their hands confidently, their responses delivered in crisp, unaccented English. Maria waited patiently, her notebook open, ready to reference her own notes. When no one else volunteered, she took a steadying breath and tentatively raised her hand. A collective hush followed, as though the very act of her raising her hand had disturbed a fragile equilibrium. Mr. Wilson turned to her with a slight narrowing of the eyes that Maria interpreted as curiosity mixed with skepticism. He motioned for her to speak with a curt gesture. Maria unfolded her spine and attempted to pronounce each word clearly, relying on the guidelines she had practiced so many nights under the dim glow of her desk lamp. Her accent tugged at the consonants and vowels, and though the meaning of her translation was accurate, her delivery was imperfect. A single mispronounced word echoed through the silence. In that instant, Mr. Wilson's expression hardened, and he raised one hand in a smooth, dismissive arc. He declared, in a tone that left no room for discussion, that English was the language of the classroom and that anyone unwilling or unable to speak it should remove themselves from his presence. A burst of laughter rippled across the room. Some students exchanged smirks. Others rolled their eyes as though they were watching a well-rehearsed performance. Maria felt her cheeks burn with shame. Her stomach twisted into knots as she slowly closed her notebook and lowered her head. The hum of fluorescent lights felt unbearably loud, and the ticking clock now sounded like a countdown to perpetual rejection. She kept her gaze fixed on her desk, willing herself not to cry and not to rise in response to his command. Without a word, she gathered her belongings with trembling fingers and slipped out of her chair. In the hallway, the air felt colder, as though the chill of exclusion had seeped into the building's core. Maria hurried past rows of lockers, her uniform collar brushing against her neck as if shielding her from prying eyes. A handful of students watched her retreating figure with a mix of pity and indifference. The distant slam of her classroom door sounded like a verdict. She did not belong. She leaned against the cool metal of a locker, closed her eyes, and drew in a shaky breath, trying to steady the storm of humiliation that raged inside her. Later, at home, the modest apartment Maria shared with her mother felt like a sanctuary from a world that judged too harshly. The small kitchen table bore the scars of everyday life: chipped edges, faint coffee stains, and a single lit lamp that cast a warm glow over worn textbooks and scribbled notes. Her mother, Rosa, moved about with the practiced calm of someone who had faced hardship before. She offered Maria a gentle smile and a steaming mug of tea flavored with cinnamon and honey. Maria rested her head on her mother's shoulder, letting the familiar scent of lavender soap and laundry detergent soothe her raw emotions. In that moment, she resolved that no teacher's words could define her worth, and that her voice, however accented, would one day carry far beyond the confines of that cold classroom. The moment the classroom door closed behind her, Maria felt the weight of every accusing gaze press against her back like a physical hand. Her heart pounded in her chest, as if each beat sounded the verdict of unworthiness. The bright hallway lights seemed harsh and unforgiving, illuminating her uniform and the neat braid in her hair as if to expose her in every detail. She moved with careful steps, toes pointed inward, avoiding eye contact with passing students who either stared in stunned silence or offered sympathetic looks that felt more like reminders of her otherness. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack, knuckles whitening, each breath drawn shallow and uncertain. Reaching the restroom, Maria pressed herself against a cool tile wall, head bowed, chest heaving with a surge of humiliation she could barely stifle. The hum of the classroom, once a place of learning and possibility, now echoed in her mind as an indictment. She took several shaky breaths, closing her eyes against the sting of unshed tears, willing herself not to sob. Each pulse of her temples felt like an echo of the teacher's words, as if they still reverberated in the air. The restroom mirror offered a distorted reflection. A small girl, shoulders slumped, with eyes that shimmered from the brink of tears. She stared at that reflection until her vision cleared and she steeled herself to continue. The rest of the school day became a blur of motion and muffled sounds. Passing periods unfolded in robotic precision. Bell rings, shifting chairs, the rustle of paper and the scrape of shoes along polished floors. In every classroom, Maria sat at the edge of her seat, vigilant for further humiliation, her ears tuned to every murmur that might single her out. She refrained from raising her hand, even when she knew the answer, preferring anonymity to fresh scrutiny. The words she once practiced in quiet confidence, carefully enunciated syllables and deliberate pauses, now felt fragile, easily snapped by ridicule. Her notebook remained closed, its neat, inked pages a secret sanctuary she refused to open in public. At lunchtime, Maria carried her sandwich to the far corner of the cafeteria, seeking out a table untouched by the day's drama. The long rows of desks and buzzing conversations, punctuated by laughter and the scrape of lunch trays, felt like a theater where she had no role. She ate with measured bites, eyes fixed on the cold tiles beneath her feet. When a group of girls from her English class passed by, giggling and pointing, she held her breath, remaining immobile, hoping the tide of indifference would wash over her. Yet even in this self-imposed solitude, the sting of exclusion lingered, an unseen bruise that throbbed with each exhale. The final bell could not come soon enough. As students poured into the hallways, Maria moved toward the exit with deliberate slowness, as though by elongating each step she could postpone the inevitable return to a home where the echoes of school would linger. When she finally stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, a gust of wind caught her hair and fluttered the edges of her uniform. The world beyond the school walls, cars driving past, neighbors walking dogs, distant hum of traffic, offered a momentary reprieve. She inhaled that open-air scent, felt the warmth of the sun fading into dusk, and allowed the tension in her shoulders to loosen by a fraction. At home, the modest apartment became a haven of soft lighting and familiar objects. The scent of simmering soup drifted from the kitchen, and framed family photographs lined the living room shelf, each image capturing moments of laughter, celebration, and quiet pride. Maria's mother greeted her with a gentle touch on the arm, guiding her to the small kitchen table where homework lay incomplete. The contrast between the school's harshness and the home's warmth was palpable. One world demanded conformity to a single standard, while the other embraced her quiet tenacity. As she unwrapped her dinner, Maria opened her notebook and allowed herself to write down the day's events, not as a record of failure, but as the beginning of a new resolve. Each line of ink became a declaration that her voice would not be silenced, her worth would not be diminished, and that one day she would transform this memory of pain into the foundation of her strength. In the gentle glow of the lamp, her pen moved steadily, charting the course of her determination as she embraced the long journey ahead. Maria's steps to the library each afternoon became a ritual of quiet rebellion against the pain etched into her memory. The moment she crossed the threshold of the building, a grand, two-story structure of stone and glass, she felt the weight of the school hallway lift from her shoulders. The librarian, an elderly woman with soft eyes and a gentle nod, welcomed Maria without question, as though she already knew the girl's unspoken promise to herself. Maria settled at a long wooden table beneath a stained glass window, its colored light dancing on her open notebook. Instead of the sterile sentences dictated by her teacher's demands, she copied paragraphs from English language classics and scientific journals, savoring each new phrase as an invitation rather than a test. Her pencil moved so steadily across the lines that the world outside her pages seemed to blur into insignificance. Each page of her notebook recorded the evolution of her understanding. Idioms that once eluded her grasp now took form in neat script. Complex grammar rules once daunting became familiar landmarks on her journey. She practiced aloud, her voice low but determined, pronouncing each word until the edges of her accent softened. Sometimes she listened to recordings of native speakers on her phone, pausing and replaying until her tongue could approximate the cadence she admired. In the quiet rhythm of these sessions, she discovered that language was more than a barrier to acceptance. It was a bridge to new worlds, a tool of empowerment that could lift her voice beyond fear. When exhaustion tightened her eyelids, she closed her notebook and allowed herself a moment of rest, staring up at the tomes that lined the shelves, many unopened, all filled with stories waiting to be claimed. One afternoon, a flyer pinned to the community board caught her eye, a contest inviting students to submit an original essay on the theme, "The American Dream Through My Eyes." The deadline loomed only 2 weeks away, but the very notion of sharing her story electrified Maria's resolve. She read the guidelines carefully, noting the word limit and the criteria that valued authenticity over perfection. Her mind raced with memories of her mother's laughter as they baked tortillas, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the tang of warm salsa, and the pride in her own heart when she first learned to order a meal in fluent English. She envisioned an essay that wove these moments together, a tapestry of two cultures, a testament to resilience. The contest promised recognition, perhaps a brief moment under the spotlight, but for Maria it represented something deeper, proof that her voice belonged in both worlds. In the quiet nights that followed, Maria transformed her daily library routine into a disciplined regimen. After finishing her tutoring sessions at the community center, she returned home to a small desk by the kitchen window where a single lamp illuminated the page before her. She drafted her essay first by hand, pouring memories onto paper without regard for punctuation. Then, with methodical care, she revised each sentence, replacing generalities with vivid details, the rasp of her teacher's voice, the shiver of embarrassment that had once coursed through her spine. The hush of admiration when she later read her words aloud at a local poetry reading. She shared excerpts with her mother, whose eyes glistened with tears and whose gentle encouragement became the wind beneath Maria's wings. Each correction, each suggestion deepened the clarity of her message that the American dream was not a monolith defined by birthplace or accent, but a living promise to those willing to seize it. On the morning of the submission, Maria rose before dawn, her heart drumming like a hummingbird within her chest. The final draft of her essay felt like an ache and a promise bound in a folder alongside her application form. She walked to school with the paper in hand, the crisp pages blurring in the dawn light, and handed it to the office without a word. As she returned to her locker, the flurry of passing students seemed distant, their laughter faint against the solid certainty that pulsed in her veins. For the first time, she understood that the act of sharing her story carried its own victory, not in accolades or prizes, but in the reclaiming of her voice. She closed her eyes and felt the echo of every sentence she had written, a quiet declaration that her accent would no longer silence her, but would instead announce her presence to the world. In that moment, the library's worn tables and the contest's blank page converged into a single truth: that language, at its heart, is not a barrier but a beacon for those daring enough to shine their light. Maria's life shifted into a new rhythm as she moved from middle school into the halls of Roosevelt High, where each corridor felt wider and each expectation higher. The morning sunlight poured through expansive windows, illuminating rows of lockers adorned with colorful magnets and club flyers. Maria navigated these halls with a quiet confidence born of nights spent mastering pronunciations and hours spent drafting essays. Gone were the trembling hands and bowed head. In their place stood a poised young woman whose gaze met the world directly. Although she still carried the weight of her early humiliation, it had transformed into a steady undercurrent of purpose rather than a source of shame. Early in her freshman year, the school counselor recognized Maria's burgeoning talent and guided her toward advanced placement courses. These classes were populated by students who spoke of standardized tests and college applications as if they were the only measure of worth. Maria, however, approached each lesson as a puzzle to solve. When complex texts in literature class threatened to overwhelm her, she relied on the analytical techniques she had cultivated in translating idioms and dissecting grammar rules. In biology labs, where peers discussed genetic sequences and microscope slides, Maria applied the same meticulous attention to detail she had once reserved for her English exercises. With each test she aced and each project she led, she reinforced the conviction that her mind was a terrain of limitless potential. Parallel to her academic pursuits, Maria's essay on the American Dream had won the regional contest, earning her a scholarship to a prestigious summer exchange program in the American Midwest. That experience marked the true beginning of her transformation. She lived with a host family in a small town whose streets were lined with maple trees and whose residents gathered every Sunday at a local church potluck. There, Maria's accent no longer marked her as other but distinguished her as a storyteller from another world. She joined debate clubs and community service initiatives, speaking at city council meetings about immigrant experiences. Her voice carried the clarity and nuance she had honed over years of practice, and her listeners responded with curiosity and respect. She returned home with not just improved language skills, but with a firm belief that storytelling could bridge cultures and heal divisions. Back at Roosevelt High, Maria's return was triumphant. The assembly hall, once the site of her greatest humiliation, now became the stage for her speech as a keynote presenter. The same rows of wooden seats that had watched her slink away in shame now held classmates and teachers paying rapt attention to her message, that language was a tool of connection and that every accent carried the imprint of a story worth hearing. She recounted the narrow slats of sunlight in the classroom and the sting of the teacher's command, but she spoke of those moments as the forge in which her resolve had been tempered. Her words resonated not only with fellow students who had faced prejudice, but with teachers who now saw her as an example of resilience and leadership. Academically, her performance earned her a place on the honor roll and invitations to join the student council and the editorial board of the school newspaper. Each new role deepened her understanding of responsibility, organizing fundraisers for language support programs, editing articles that highlighted cultural diversity, and mentoring underclassmen struggling with English. Her bilingual fluency became an asset, not a liability, as she translated announcements for Spanish-speaking families during parent-teacher conferences. She found herself in demand, not in spite of her heritage, but because of the unique perspective it gave her. Outside of school, Maria volunteered at the public library's after-school program, guiding younger children through storybooks that blended English and Spanish. She watched their eyes light up when they recognized a familiar phrase or repeated a word correctly, and she felt the same spark of possibility that had first ignited in her own heart. Each session ended with applause or hugs, tangible affirmations that her voice had made a difference. The library walls, once silent witnesses to her solitary studies, now echoed with the laughter and chatter of children discovering the power of words. Family life at home provided the grounding that sustained her growth. Her mother, Rosa, took pride in the crisp uniform Maria wore and the accolades she brought home. In the evenings, they cooked traditional meals together, filling the small kitchen with the aroma of cumin, chili, and fresh cilantro. Over bowls of caldo and tortillas, they spoke not of grades or awards, but of dreams and values. Rosa reminded Maria that nobody's worth could be measured by their accent or appearance, and Maria repaid that assurance by supporting her mother's ambition to enroll in evening classes, translating textbooks and assisting with computer tutorials. By the time graduation rolled around, Maria stood tall in her cap and gown, tassels swinging at the side that marked her readiness to embrace new challenges. She had earned acceptance letters from multiple universities, each scholarship reflecting recognition of her achievements and her potential. Yet in that moment, she thought not of campuses or accolades, but of the journey from the child who had once been silenced to the young woman whose voice led assemblies, whose words inspired classmates, and whose presence embodied the promise of inclusion. As she stepped off the stage to the applause of her peers and the proud embrace of her mother, she carried with her the enduring truth that transformation is born of persistence, and that the passage from humiliation to empowerment can illuminate a path for all who follow. The auditorium smelled of polished wood and fresh paint, its rows of seats gleaming under soft overhead lights. Students, parents, and teachers gathered in hushed anticipation for the end-of-year assembly at Roosevelt Middle School. Years had passed since Maria Ramirez last stepped into these halls as a frightened 9-year-old with bowed head. Now she moved through the double doors with measured grace, her posture straight, her dark hair neatly braided at the nape of her neck. She carried nothing but a slim binder containing the speech she had crafted to transform humiliation into hope. The stage was set with a single podium and a backdrop of school banners, their bold letters proclaiming unity in diversity. Behind her, the familiar logos and mascots seemed to wink in recognition of how far she had come. In the center aisle, rows of chairs filled quickly. Maria found her seat among the guest speakers, civic leaders, alumni, and local advocates, each awaiting their turn at the podium. She sat quietly, her uniform modest but immaculate, the badge of her former self replaced by the confident glow of someone who had mastered adversity. Across the floor, down in the front row reserved for the faculty, sat Mr. Wilson, her former English teacher. His crisp suit and tie remained professional, but his posture betrayed a certain tension. A subtle stiffening of shoulders, a slight turn of the head whenever someone mentioned the words language or respect. He glanced at the program in his lap, where names and titles marched in block letters. When he saw hers, his eyes widened almost imperceptibly, as if the spotlight of memory had illuminated a corner of his conscience he had long neglected. The ceremony began with introductions and awards, each announcement punctuated by polite applause. Maria listened with calm patience, her mind rehearsing the cadence of her opening lines. She noted the flicker of Mr. Wilson's gaze as photographs of past assemblies and student achievements glided across a projection screen, recalling images of herself in those same snapshots, smiling under duress, younger and uncertain. The contrast between then and now settled like a gentle challenge across the space between them. She did not speak up or wave, she simply observed, letting the silence amplify the gravity of her presence. When the moment arrived, the principal gestured toward the podium. Maria rose and crossed the stage with steady steps, each footfall echoing faintly in the hushed hall. She placed her binder on the lectern and surveyed the audience, her gaze sweeping over familiar faces, former classmates, neighbors, parents, before settling on Mr. Wilson. Their eyes met, and in that instant, a quiet exchange passed between them, recognition of a shared past, acknowledgement of an unspoken debt. Maria inhaled deeply, feeling the collected, expectant energy of the room, and began to speak. Her voice carried clear and true, resonating without amplification at first, then growing in strength as she invoked the power of words to both harm and heal. She painted a picture of her younger self, standing in that very classroom, heart pounding, confronted by a demand that severed her voice from her identity. She recounted the sting of humiliation and the silence that followed, silence that had threatened to define her, to embed itself in her very core. But she did not dwell on that moment as a wound. Instead, she described how it had ignited a purpose, to reclaim her voice and to ensure that no child would feel unworthy of speaking simply because their accent sounded different. As she spoke, images appeared behind her on the projection screen, snapshots of her journey. Nights spent in the library, notes scrawled in a spiral notebook, a plane touching down at a summer exchange program. Children in a community center listening to her bilingual story time. The auditorium lights dimmed on her silhouette, casting her words into sharp relief against the vibrant montage. The crowd leaned forward, absorbed by her narrative of transformation, of an immigrant daughter who had turned shame into strength. Across the aisle, Mr. Wilson's expression shifted. Lines creased at the corners of his eyes as he watched the photos of Maria tutoring younger children, his hardened stance softening into humility. He heard her describe the moment he had banished her from the classroom, how it had haunted her steps, and realized that his words had carried weight beyond a single period or lesson. In her account, those words had become the crucible in which she had forged unshakable confidence. The teacher who once wielded language as a weapon now saw it wielded as a tool for empowerment. When Maria concluded, her final phrase lingered in the stillness, that every voice, no matter its inflection or origin, deserves to be heard. For a heartbeat, the auditorium remained silent, as though the audience held its breath in collective reflection. Then, like a wave breaking against the shore, applause erupted, first tentative, then swelling into a standing ovation. Maria bowed her head in gratitude, her eyes moist with the realization that her story had bridged the gap between past and present, shame and dignity. Mr. Wilson was among the first to rise. He clapped with a fervor born of genuine admiration and remorse. As others joined him, he traced the lines of Maria's face in his memory, envisioning the frightened child he had once dismissed, now standing tall as a beacon of resilience. He whispered a silent apology to the empty air between them, acknowledging the transformation she had inspired in him as well as in herself. After the ceremony, attendees gathered in clusters, the air alive with conversation and shared emotion. Maria stepped down from the stage and felt hands extend to congratulate her, prominent community figures, former classmates, even those who had once mocked her accent. She offered each a graceful nod and a quiet word of thanks. Finally, she approached Mr. Wilson, who waited with a solemn smile and eyes that glistened with unspoken sentiment. Without words, she handed him a framed copy of one excerpt from her speech, the lines set in elegant script, "Every voice is a bridge between worlds." He accepted it with trembling hands, his voice caught in his throat. In that gesture, they both understood that the chapter of humiliation had closed and a new chapter of mutual respect had begun. One built on the recognition that true teaching occurs not only in classrooms but in the hearts and lives we touch thereafter. Months after the assembly, Maria stood before a gathering far larger than she had ever imagined, the grand opening of the Voice Without Borders Learning Center, a community space she had founded to support immigrant and refugee students in mastering English and embracing their cultural heritage. The center's facade gleamed under midday sun, its walls adorned with vibrant murals depicting children reading, speaking, and laughing together. Inside, rows of desks were arranged in clusters, each surface strewn with bilingual storybooks, journals, and art supplies. A long table at the back bore trays of refreshments, empanadas, fruit platters, and thermoses of sweet tea, offering a taste of the home many of these families had left behind. Maria moved through the room with quiet authority, greeting tutors, volunteers, and dozens of smiling children whose eyes sparkled with the same curiosity she once had. Every handshake and nod reinforced the distance she had traveled from the frightened girl who had slipped from room 204 with bowed head. At the center of the room stood a raised platform draped in a banner proclaiming the center's motto, "Your voice is your power." Maria climbed the few steps, the applause swelling around her like a wave. She surveyed the sea of faces, families clutching letters of enrollment, community leaders who had supported her vision, and children whose accents still wavered as they tried new words. In a specially reserved seat near the front sat Mr. Wilson, now retired and invited as a guest of honor. He wore a simple jacket, unadorned, his posture still dignified but softened by the anticipation of witnessing the fruition of the student he had once dismissed. Maria's gaze found his among the crowd, and she offered him a small, respectful nod. There were no hard feelings in that gesture, only recognition that both teacher and student had grown through shared history. She stepped to the lectern, the polished wood cool beneath her fingertips, and spoke without a script. Her voice, honed by countless practice sessions and tempered by lifelong determination, carried effortlessly through the room. She recounted the story of her first English lesson, the sting of words meant to exclude and the spark that had ignited as she turned shame into fuel for growth. Behind her, a slideshow projected images of her journey, a small girl in a worn uniform studying under a lamp, teenage Maria delivering her essay at the summer exchange program, and finally images of volunteers tutoring children in the very space they now occupied. The photos faded into each other, illustrating how humiliation had been transformed into hope, each step in her path building toward this moment of collective celebration. Her closing words rang clearly: that language is not merely a means of communication, but a bridge that connects hearts, ideas, and cultures. She reminded the audience that every student who walked through these doors carried a story shaped by courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that their voice mattered. As she finished, the applause rose again, sustained and heartfelt, filling the room with warmth. Maria stepped down from the platform and moved toward Mr. Wilson, who rose to meet her halfway. In his eyes, she saw a mixture of pride and humility, a reflection of the teacher he had become because of the lesson she had taught him. Though no words passed between them, their shared silence spoke volumes, that forgiveness, understanding, and growth could flourish when one chose to listen rather than judge. In the days that followed, the center thrived. Community members volunteered as reading partners, retired educators mentored tutors, and local businesses donated supplies. Maria organized weekly story circles where children narrated tales of their families' journeys, weaving English and Spanish into narratives that celebrated dual heritage. Each story, each phrase mastered, served as a testament to the center's mission to elevate voices that had been muted by prejudice and to cultivate confidence that would carry students into adulthood. Mr. Wilson became a regular visitor, offering guidance on curriculum development and sharing teaching strategies with new volunteers. He often lingered in the back of classrooms, observing the vibrant exchanges he had once quashed, now flourishing under an atmosphere of respect and encouragement. Through his transformation, he demonstrated that the capacity to learn and to change is not limited by age, position, or past mistakes. The center's success became a living example of how one person's resilience can ignite systemic change, turning a single moment of cruelty into a legacy of compassion. In the center's final slide presentation months later, a photograph captured Maria and Mr. Wilson standing side by side before a mural that read, "Every accent is a story." Their smiles were gentle but sure, reflecting the journey they had shared, from exclusion to inclusion, from silence to speech. As the lights dimmed, Maria's closing message illuminated the room. That true empowerment arises when we recognize the inherent worth in every voice and offer the gift of attentive listening. In that lesson lay the center's enduring moral, that dignity is neither given nor taken, but earned through acts of empathy, understanding, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves to be heard.